Welcome to UpWell The Podcast. I'm Sarah, and this is my beautiful co-host, Katie. As fellow female entrepreneurs turned friends and now business partners, we are so happy you're here.
With every episode, it is our sole purpose to share authentic conversations to inspire your personal level up. Take our curiosity, add your best intentions, and flow with us in the UpWell.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of UpWell The Podcast. I'm Sarah. This is my beautiful co-host, Katie, and we are glad to have you.
Yes, welcome to the show. We have a special guest today. His name is Jake LaMore, and he is the host of the Kankakee Podcast, and he is also an on-air personality from Milner Broadcasting. He is a husband and a father, and we are so happy to have him here with us.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. Thank you. I
Wonderful.
Really
welcome.
Yeah.
We love having another podcaster in our presence.
And likewise, I love getting to meet other podcasters, especially ones that are local to the Kankakee area and ones that I did not know about, so I'm always excited to learn, I have a list actually of I try to keep track of all the local podcasts in the area just so I know what's going on, just so I know so-and-so is doing a podcast, this person's doing a podcast. It's awesome. And there's more and more.
Yeah, so, I love that because I think so many people shy away from starting their own because it's such a saturated, if you will, industry, and it's such an up and coming thing. I think that scares people sometimes. They're like, what do I have to share? What am I going to add to this industry? What am I going to do different than this other podcast that's maybe either similar to the idea that I have or in the same vicinity,
Yes.
But nobody can present it the way you can either. And I think that's one thing that you need to always remember when that fear kind of comes up is that there, even if there is another one that does the same sort of topic, nobody's going to present it the same way as you do.
Yeah. And I don't know if it's completely become oversaturated yet. Last I checked, which I'm not sure on the dates for this, but I don't think the amount of podcasts have even reached the amount of YouTube channels yet. So YouTube is definitely has been considered oversaturated for a while now, but I don't think there's not as many podcasts as there are YouTube channels yet.
Room
At
for
least
growth.
I think. So there's still room for growth.
Yeah, I love that.
It's still, I don't think, of course it all depends on what expert you talk to in the field. Some are starting to say that podcasts have peaked. I don't think we've reached the peak yet. I think we still haven't gotten there. It's getting closer. It's a lot closer than it was 10 years ago. Yeah.
I think it's people's preferred way to gather information right now. I really do. I think, we've gone through these different eras where it was like television, first it was radio, then it was television. And now I think podcasting has gotten to the point where that is where people consume most of their information outside of social media and things like that. But I would prefer to listen. I like multitasking. There's something to be said about being able to listen to something and learn, and still do something else, while you're driving, while you're doing household chores, whatever it is. So I think that's the cool thing about podcasting.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the beauty of it. It's very versatile. You can do almost anything you want. And, from whether it's you're pointing out the listener perspective. From that, you can listen while you're washing the dishes or while you're driving or while you're exercising, and then you can pause it.
Yeah.
You don't have to miss the juicy part or the part that the whole reason you tuned into the podcast. You wanted to hear, Britney Spears talk about her relationship with Justin,
skip to that part.
Right. Skip to that part. You're finally getting to that part.
Now you know what age group we are here.
Yeah. That was just the first thing that came to my mind, but you can pause it and, if you have to go to a meeting, if you pick the kids up from school, you can come back to it, and that's the beauty, part of the beauty of it.
Of listening, for sure.
Now, what actually brought you into the podcast world? What drew you to wanting to start a podcast?
It's so weird how it has kind of become a circle at this point. I started podcasting to get into radio.
Okay.
And then radio provided me the experience and the platform and the name to start a podcast, which ended up being Kankakee Podcast. So it's kind of funny how the two really played a role. But in 2014, I started to go to broadcasting school because I wanted to be in radio. So I went to this one-year program. It's called the Illinois Media School. They still exist up in Chicago. They had a campus in Lombard at the time, so I went to that one versus the one in the city because it's closer. So living in Mancino, it was already an hour or so to get to Lombard. And my first radio instructor, who became one of my best friends, still is to this day, Don Geisinger, amazing man. He advised me in order to get experience behind a microphone, he said, you should start a podcast. He had a podcast at the time. And so that intrigued me, and I had heard of podcasts before then. But that's what led me to start podcasting. Was the whole reason was so I got experience talking behind the microphone, because it's easier for some, it's harder for others. You gotta find your comfort zone. But anyway, so I started doing that, and then eventually, actually, it wasn't so many months later that I wound up getting an on-air job at Milner Media on their country station. Okay. So that was the whole point. It wasn't to become this big, podcaster. I didn't, especially 10 years ago, making it as a podcaster was much, much harder. I thought getting to the point where I am now was forever out of my reach. And I thought it would be much longer to be able to say, my full-time job now is whether I'm hosting a podcast or I'm helping someone record their podcast, that's what I do. And I never thought, it would come as quickly as it did. Which, in grand scheme, it took about 8 years, 10 years. It took some time, but regardless, and I'm trying not to ramble, but in a nutshell, that's how that came to be. I really loved radio, and that's where I wanted to be. But then eventually, the more I did podcasting, the more I loved it, because there was a lot more freedom. I didn't have to worry about, if someone dropped an F-bomb, or if someone, I have to worry about the FCC or just, I could, there's just more freedom, I guess.
Absolutely.
Yeah, more creative freedom.
So now you actually have what's called the Kankakee Podcast.
Yes.
What does that specifically entail? Like, what's your kind of genre, I guess?
So if you look it up on any of the podcast platforms, you're going to see the genre that it falls under is society and culture.
Okay.
But basically, I tell people Kankakee Podcast is about the people and places of Kankakee County, past, present, future. And we try to cover a variety of things that are local, whether it's, like right now we're sitting on, what was once A.O. Smith, right? The water heaters and all of that. We haven't done an episode on A.O. Smith yet, but we eventually will, because that's the kind of things we cover. We'll cover things like that up until like, hey, Sally decided she's going to build a monument in downtown Bourbonnais, and it's dedicated to this really important figure in our history. So,
and you'll cover
her
like
to connect with her and have her come on and talk about that.
I like
That's
that.
Completely fictional.
I know, I'm like, who's Sally? Who's Sally?
No, I couldn't think of a direct example, but just try to throw a plethora, and then a lot of people, a lot of it is geared towards arts too. We've had a lot of music artists on and things of that too. So we just try to make it as variety as much variety as possible.
Yeah, I would think doing that would help your listenership grow, because it's such a wide array of topics, that could be interesting to so many different groups of people, different age ranges, different backgrounds, different
demographics.
Yeah, yeah. So I think I like the idea, because I feel like that's very parallel to what we do. It's kind of a wellness-based podcast, but we talk about how to level up your life in a lot of different ways. So, we have a variety of guests. We've had everything, we've talked about a lot of different things.
And I have listened to it.
Well, good.
Yes.
I'm glad.
Yeah, and
That's awesome.
I enjoyed it. They were great.
Well, that's
very
good.
easy to consume, very conversational.
Those
are the ones I like the best.
Yeah.
So.
That's what we shoot for.
Yeah.
That's what we shoot for here at UpWell.
Yeah.
So what are a few things that you would offer to people who are thinking about starting a podcast? Like, what should they do? What should they not do? What would...
Yeah, I mean, again, it all varies, from person to person.
Right.
It really depends on what type of podcast they're thinking about, or, most of the time, I feel like if you look up articles or read blogs from podcast experts, a lot of them are around the same summer. Like, no, this is Bible. This is you have to do it this way. You can't do it any other way. Some things, are true, but not always. I would say is, especially if you're brand new to media as a whole and really putting yourself in the position of facilitating a conversation, or let's say you're the host and you're not having any guests on the podcast. If you're really brand new to it and you're not exactly sure if you think you'll stick into it or stick with it, the entry level to starting a podcast, you don't have to go all out. You don't have to get the $600, $800 microphone and then the $700 podcast mixer and all that. You don't.
We are living proof.
It's true. You don't have to do that.
Exactly.
I've read many articles, sat in with other experienced podcasters, and say you can start with the earbuds and microphone that comes with your Apple phone. Like, you could simply start with just using the microphone that's
I see big level podcasters still doing that.
Yeah.
Like, they are like, yep, this works for me.
Well, what's weird is, and I don't know if he still does, but if you ever watch Ryan Seacrest doing one of his radio shows, you will see he doesn't wear the traditional closed back headphones. He wears earbuds while he's doing his radio shows, and that is, to me, just the strangest thing in the world. I would hate that. Absolutely. I mean, he's using a $800 microphone or whatever, $1,000 microphone, but like for listening, he's using like I said, I don't know if he's still doing that, but he was, and
we're gonna find out.
And we're talking about Ryan Seacrest, so I did notice that. But yeah, you can literally start that small, or like if you're local to the Kankakee area, I mean, you can get an entry level microphone that sounds decent at like King Music for like $100, and maybe even less than that, depending on they've got a mic called the iRig. You plug it looks just like a microphone you see on TV all the time that news reporters are holding. You can take this iRig microphone, plug it right into your phone, and record directly to your phone, and you didn't spend that much money. And then, if you're wanting to do both audio and video for your podcast, just start out with, if most people have a decent camera on their phone these days, start with that.
Yeah.
And then,
it really does work, everybody. If you're tuning in, this is our Barnes & Noble microphone setup and our phone cameras.
Our phone cameras, yep.
Yep.
So, and then to go even further, when it comes to the hosting part, there are some free hosting platforms out there where, if you're not wanting to commit, $10 or $20 a month paying for a hosting service that will distribute your podcast to all the major platforms like Apple and Spotify, There's a company called Red Circle where you can host your podcast for free, and they will distribute it to all of those major platforms where people can find you. So, the entry to get in is very inexpensive. And I say though, if you're doing well, if you're liking the podcast medium, then, you can invest.
And get fancy chairs like we did.
You can get fancy chairs. You can, get different mics or stands or cameras or, then you can.
A sign.
Yeah, a sign, and then you can, get, I feel like when I started, I felt like I had to have more techie stuff. And I didn't have the most techie stuff, but there were definitely things that I didn't need that I thought I needed. And I went and I spent the money on them, but that's also part of me just being a gearhead. I came from being a musician and constantly getting new guitars or new amps. And so I think that kind of transferred over when I started podcasting. I'm like, oh, wow, check out all this cool stuff.
Yeah.
So in a nutshell.
Aside from the tangible things like microphones and programs and things like that, what about the intangible? What about, mindset, or even, getting comfortable with the sound of your own voice, knowing what to talk about, anything you could share with people if they are like, I want to start a podcast, but I don't know, a specific niche that I want to go into, or how do you even figure out creatively what you want to do?
Your passions. It all starts with your passions. If you're going to do a podcast, if you're going to do a blog, if you're going to, any of that, but obviously specifically podcasting, you want to do a podcast on something that you are passionate about. Because otherwise you're going to get tired of it real quick. You might even get tired of it if it's something you're passionate about. That happens. But I would definitely, that's your first, if you really don't, you want to start a podcast, but you're just not sure, you haven't narrowed it down to exactly what you want to do your podcast about. Yeah, start with your passions. Just ask yourself the question, what are you passionate about? Yeah. And then write down those ideas, type them out however, you work, and then just kind of narrow it down from there. And you most of the time you will get told that you'll see the term niche down. You want to be as niche down as possible, which some people listening to this might point at me and be like, well, you didn't niche down a ton on Kankakee Podcast just because really it's all over the place. But it's, and I will say, there are sometimes I'm like, maybe we should have just focused down and been like, okay, this is a Kankakee music podcast,
but I think there's something,
so far.
I really think there's something to be said though for the, the specialist versus the generalist. I feel like we've become so specialized as a society that I think society as a whole is kind of wanting to go back to that generalist, because our topic was, we wanted to help people. That was our kind of overall encompassing passion. Okay. And so that's why we haven't really niched down our show either. We keep it under the umbrella of what can we present to people to help them in any facet of their life, because that's what we're passionate about. And so we didn't niche down either, because I feel like people do kind of want more of that general stuff as opposed to that super specific, having to go here for this person, here for that person, here for that person. People, I think, are wanting to go to that one person now, or that one place for,
Yeah, and I mean, that can work. If you only, I guess, niche down to a certain degree, which is kind of like what both of you have done. And I guess you could sort of say that for Kankakee Podcast. It's niche, but it's focused on a certain area. It's a local podcast, but it's not necessarily focusing on just one factor.
Correct.
In that area.
I can say we're probably not going to have somebody on to teach you how to play the guitar.
That's a little different.
It's not a music podcast.
It's not a music podcast.
Maybe someday.
Who knows? Yeah. We'll never, rule that out. But
right. But I kind of, a lot of people are like, oh, I love Joe Rogan and people like that, and they're like, well, Joe Rogan is all over the place, But it's like, okay, but we have to remember there's like, I don't know, 1 or 2%.
Correct.
Of Joe Rogan's,
Mhm.
you know, and yes, they can do that. They can call their podcast, or they can include their name in their podcast name,
Mhm.
you know, and get away with it because that person has, you know,
They're established
they're
as a
established.
person.
Exactly. They can do that. So I would, you know, shy away from being general.
Too
And
general.
then, you know, maybe later on, if you find that you're finding success with whatever podcast that you've really niched down on, and maybe you feel like you've kind of gotten to that part where you feel like you're established, and then you can kind of expand and get a little more beyond just that bracketed down niche, you know. That's what I would suggest. And I would not start out, you know, naming your podcast with your name like the Joe Rogan Experience or anything like that.
Yeah.
Unless you are established in like the community that you are going to talk about, and even then, like if you're not like, you know, people would need to know. People need to be able to say your name, and that person will automatically know
who it is.
Yeah.
Like Taylor Swift. Everyone knows who Taylor Swift is. You know, not everyone is Taylor Swift. Not everyone's Joe Rogan. So that's what I would suggest, especially when it comes to naming. You want to make it clear to the listener what they're going to be listening to, and like even with the UpWell, like I know that this has something to do with wellness. Like so, you know, I already know that, which is good.
Right.
You know, it's good that I know that. So, yeah.
Tell me, I want to know about the long game. Because you've been doing this for a long time. And, you know, we're only about a year in. And you get to that point, I'm sure it happens over and over, where it gets hard. It's like, this is more physically demanding than I thought, mentally.
Time consuming.
Yes, like all of the things. And obviously, it can still be a passion and it can still be a challenge at the same time. So mindset wise, tell us some things that would help people, you know, if maybe they've already started a podcast or they're looking to and they want to stick with it for a long period of time and they want to get through those phases of maybe burnout.
Oh yeah, burnout's a real thing. I know that many of your guests have talked about that with whatever industry they're working in, right? We've all experienced it to a certain degree. If you're feeling burnt out on your podcast, but you're not necessarily at the point you want to give it up, it's always just good to take a step back and just change the way you're doing something.
Yeah.
When I was hosting the Pop Punk and Pizza podcast,
Wait, what?
I know. I was like drinking and I'm like, pause.
I know, it's a mouthful.
TV timeout. Say that again.
That was my that was not my first podcast. It was probably, by the time I created that podcast, it was probably my third or fourth podcast. Again, I went to my passions on that one. Really loved pop punk music, and I really loved pizza. So I just married the two together, and I said, we're going to interview pop punk bands while we eat pizza together.
I love that.
So thank you.
It's like Hot Ones, but different.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah, that was in 2016 when I started doing that.
Are those archived somewhere? Can I listen to those?
The podcast still exists. I just no longer host it. I no longer own it. I don't have any stakes in it anymore.
I'm going to have to listen to that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I hosted over 200 episodes of that. And then I passed it off to my intern at the time, Noelle, who is now the host of it, and it's her podcast now.
That's really cool.
That happened about a year ago, so it was like November of 22, like the fall-ish is when I. So
you did that one for a while.
I did, yeah, from 16 to 22.
Nice.
But during that time, I did find myself, getting burnt out and getting to a point where I'm just like, yeah, this is not working. And I tried all kinds of different things, whether it was kind of just switching up the structure of the show, I mean, I did all kinds of things. So don't be afraid to change up. Nothing is grandfathered in.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're just like, you know what, this podcast is not for me, go ahead, start another one. Start thinking about another one that you can do. And that's why part of the reason I left Pop Punk and Pizza was I wasn't feeling a fire burning in my heart for the podcast any longer. I still love punk oriented music. I still love pizza, but I wasn't stoked about like when we were about to record a new episode. I was kind of like, oh, do I have to do this? Like,
Okay.
I was just kind of feeling, and I still loved everything about it. And I have no, it's only been about a year. I've got no regrets. I don't look back on it in any ill will. I just wasn't feeling the driving force. All I could think about at that time was Kankakee Podcast. That was the only thing I could think about. So I knew it was time.
Well,
and I felt like your audience can tell if you're being authentic.
Right.
Yeah.
And I kind of felt that too, because part of me was like, I feel like this isn't going any further as far as growth, because I felt like I wasn't the guy. I wasn't the person, to do this.
To do that show anymore.
Yeah. So I felt like it was
well, I think we all experience personal evolutions numerous times in our lives. So,
yes.
You have to be able to pivot and persevere. It's like kind of those two things in tandem in anything in life, really.
Right.
I could apply that to just about anything, but I like everything that you just said, because it really does help you kind of visualize, if you start to feel like this, these are kind of your options. You can either push through it and keep going, or you can readjust and think about what you're really passionate about now, or if you need to go in a different direction.
Yeah, it's okay to change, and just because you change does not mean you don't like that said thing anymore. Obviously, sometimes that is the case. You're just like, I just had a terrible experience.
I'm done.
I am done. Like, screw that industry. But other times it's just kind of like, you've had your fill, and you're just like, I'm good. Like, that was awesome, but I'm feeling something else right now. Or maybe you're craving something new. You're just not sure what it is yet.
Yeah. Right.
So yeah, I hope I answered the question.
You did.
Yeah.
I do want to ask if you have any favorite resources for people. I guess we're kind of generally talking about people that want to start a podcast or are interested in either growing their podcast or continuing with it. But what are some books or maybe other podcasts that you can listen to that would help keep you inspired, or maybe teach you a few of the more fundamental things that you need to know to even start?
As you can imagine, like any industry, when something shows that there's a lot of potential to make a lot of money, you will see a lot of people coming up in that industry that are like, I can get your podcast to grow, $2 million in revenue next year and all that. There are a lot of podcast coaches and yada, yada. And a lot of them have podcasts that are free that you can listen to, which is good. They do offer a lot of free content. I would just shy away from anyone that guarantees you growth, because I feel like that's just not anything you can
control.
It's not something you can guarantee. It's like there's a lot of factors in all of that, Sure, like you can have the greatest instructors, the greatest advisors, and all of that, and still land flat on your face. You could have the greatest. I mean, how many times have we seen a movie that has our favorite director or favorite actress or actor, and it's just
a dud.
A dud. It just doesn't resonate.
It's a dud, and you see the trailer, and you're just like, wow, that looks amazing. And then you go watch it, and you're like, that was the worst thing I've ever. And especially when it's like the movies that have like star-studded cast, like everyone in there is like the biggest name in Hollywood at that time. Oh my gosh, this is gonna knock it out of the park, and then it's just
I only trust Tom Hanks.
I mean,
guaranteed going to be a good movie.
Yeah,
he's the only one.
He's pretty solid, and there's only a few Tom Hanks. But anyway,
well, last I checked, there's only one Tom Hanks.
Of their caliber.
Got
it. Okay,
I was. Thank you for saying that. I should have been more specific. Yes, but no, really, there is only one Tom Hanks. No one can be Tom Hanks besides Tom Hanks. So. There are the only one that comes off the top of my head as far as a name of a podcast where you can learn more about podcast growth. There is one called Grow the Show that I've listened to from time to time that offers some good tidbits. And Kevin, who hosts that show, he does have a whole,
program that you can buy and all that.
Mm-hmm. I just, that stuff is a lot of money, and they push you hard anytime you show interest in it. It's kind of like life or death if you don't sign up for this thing. I'm not saying those things are bad. I just, be careful.
Yeah. Anything that promises a quick fix, kind of.
Yeah, I
sometimes
just
stay away from.
Right. Whether it's a quick fix or just like, I guarantee you'll get, 4 times the growth in, the 1 year that you do our program. I don't know. I'm weary or leery of those. Another one that I didn't really sign up for until this year, because I'm always trying to keep adapt to, new podcast tech or what's happening in the industry, or just different ways to just do production of podcasts. There's a newsletter or an e-newsletter called Pod News that I would highly suggest signing up for, because it's a daily newsletter, and it has everything from, Spotify fired 1,500 people to things like, hey, here's a free seminar where you can learn how to improve your podcast recording. It's, it's a webinar. It's only an hour long, doesn't cost you anything. And it's by someone from Riverside.fm, which is one of the heavy hitters in podcast production.
Mm-hmm.
So like, or it'll have interviews with other podcasters, or it's just a nice plethora of different podcast knowledge, and it's absolutely free to get this newsletter in your inbox every day. So I would definitely
start there.
There's a lot of great resources there, from all kinds of different things. One of the most recent things, as most industries are right now, is just exploring AI, artificial intelligence, and trying to figure out, how they can use it as a tool, not necessarily to take over a person's job, but just that person using it as a tool for their job to just help them with whatever
simplicity, ease.
Yeah. So those are some things I would suggest. There's so many.
Even I think just staying curious and just just making it a priority to keep learning, whether that's reading books or blog posts or listening to a podcast about it, because I think it's going to keep you inspired along the journey. But I also think it puts that, we talk about this all the time too, but that puts that personal responsibility on you. Like, you're not going to start a podcast tomorrow and be Joe Rogan Experience the next day or the next month or even probably the next year. Like, that was the Friends theme song. But I think putting it on yourself to continually learn and keep up with the times and learn how you can improve things, whether that's your actual equipment or your ability to communicate, whatever that is, I think shows in your podcast too, if you keep doing that on your end. It's like keeping that bargain, with end of the bargain with yourself as you try to grow.
Yes. And growth takes a long time. It really does. Some people, and I tell them, Kankakee Podcast has been around for 2.5 years at this point. And they're like, oh, wow. So, you must have quite a big
millions.
And I'm like, there's still so many people that do not even know we exist. There's a lot of people just we've got, 100 and or 105,000 people in the county, you know? And I mean, there's so many people that still don't know what Kankakee Podcast is. It takes a long time to grow a podcast, no matter what type of podcast it is. And some are luckier than others, sure, but that's not how it always works.
What do you think is the most effective way to grow?
Organically.
Last questions. Yeah, it was just
organically. I mean,
word of mouth.
One of the best things that the podcast I mentioned earlier called Grow the Show, one of the tools that I learned from that podcast was something they swear by. It's like part of their, structure. It's like part of their Bible, and they call it targeted daily engagement. And that's referring to social media. Instead of doing paid ads on social media, or every time you drop a new episode and you share it in 20 different Facebook groups. Let's say it's a food podcast and you're a member of 20 different food podcasts, and you just share away your episode in all those groups. And I've seen this and I've experienced this myself. Like, anytime I've done that, usually you don't get a lot of reaction. You don't get a lot of people liking it or commenting on it or anything like that. It's just kind of it just dives off. So instead, you could do targeted daily engagement for 5 to 10 to 15 minutes a day, where you open up wherever your audience is. That's another important thing I should figure out. You have to figure out where your audience lives online, or just in the real world too. But let's say your audience, you figured out they live on Instagram. So forget about a Facebook, forget about a TikTok, LinkedIn. You figured out your audience is on Instagram. So you are going to spend 10 to 15 minutes a day just engaging with them on Instagram. And that just means, commenting on a listener's post or a potential listener's post, or it's maybe another media outlet that's very similar to yours, and you engage in conversation in meaningful ways. You don't just you try not to make it generic where it's just like, oh, cool. You try to, let's say it's someone posts something that you can really share a very deep experience with. You talk about, oh yeah, when my dog passed away, I tell you, I didn't come out of my room for 3 days. Things like that, where you're really having a heart to heart. And what happens is you kind of create this footprint, and people are they get curious about, okay, who is this person? Who is Sarah? Who's Katie? And then they're eventually, if they start seeing you more, they're going to click on your profile, and they're going to look and be like, what does this person do? And they're going to look at your links, and then, they'll give you a follow, and then then eventually they'll click on your link in your Instagram bio, and they'll check out your podcast or your blog or your YouTube channel.
It's you got to lead them to you through meaningful connections.
And this goes for me too. I am just as guilty as this. No one likes a sales pitch, right? I mean, we want to be sold, but not be sold. So that's what you're doing. That's something you can just do, like I said, 10 minutes a day. And then, try for the rest of the day not to spend all your time on social media, so that way you can do other things related to your podcast. But I have seen that when I have stuck to that religiously, that I have seen people coming and liking my page. And then sometimes I feel like I've seen maybe my podcast numbers go up a little bit if I feel like I had some strong targeted daily engagement, that day or that last couple of days or whatever it might be. It's just, it's offering up something in the comments section on whatever social media platform you're in. You don't have to be on all social media platforms. Pick
a targeted one.
Yes, you have to figure out where your audience is at. And then once you figure that out, that's where you engage with them.
Yeah. And it's all a learning process. I think,
Yes.
coming full circle with everything we've talked about, it really is like you start and you learn as you go. It's like, what's the ready, fire, aim? Go take action, start doing, something you're passionate about, sharing what you want to talk about, and then you figure it out, one step at a time.
I keep reading that more and more, that the best way to grow your podcast is organically and really focusing on what you currently have and just trying to engage with it. Even, I don't care if it's just 5 people that are listening to your podcast. If you really engage with them, they're really going to be inspired to tell their friend about your podcast.
Right.
Because I mean, more and more you're getting asked that question. So what do you listen to? Or like, you listen to music, you listen to podcasts, more and more you're seeing people on Facebook or whatever saying like, I need some new podcast recommendations. What do you guys listen to? And hopefully your friend will chime in and say, hey, I really love the UpWell podcast because let me tell you, Katie really told me some personal stories in her life that really helped me. And that's kind of what they do on their podcast. And I really like what they're doing.
Right. Yeah.
So they're more apt to
share.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's one thing about, and it's actually something we just talked about. You have to present yourself in an authentic way in order to be relatable, in order for there to be that organic growth of everything. Because if you come across as phony, that's readable real quick.
Oh yeah, you can figure that out real quick.
That's real quick.
And that is something that is transferable to
everybody,
every industry. I don't care what you're doing, because when I started working in radio, I was told that same thing. I was told the listeners are going to know if you truly love Taylor Swift or not.
You better tell the truth.
They're going to tell.
Figure that out. So I mean,
you have to bring your most authentic self to the table.
That's a great point.
And
especially the podcasting medium is a very intimate medium. It's a very personal
a lot
medium.
of transparency.
You are in someone's ears, and you want to, when you're speaking, you want to pretend like you're listening, or you're talking to one person.
Yes.
Try not to do. I try to steer clear of the references of "Hey everybody" and things like that, because you're not.
You mean how we open our show?
It's okay. Everyone does it.
We're evolving, you guys.
But it's something that, again, I started learning that in radio. That was one of the very first things I was told too, is like, you are talking to one person sitting in their car now, and they are just having the crappiest day. And it is your job to turn their day around and share something informative, something that's a little funny. Like, hey, it's Jake LaMore. I put my socks don't match today. The light in my closet didn't work. I had to run out the door, grab whatever I could. I came to the radio station, and the secretary laughed at me because I had, So, maybe they'll get a kick out of that. That little story.
Tip of information that I actually read, and it's interesting because it's something I had forgotten about, is that in this kind of arena of business, you should always think about who your perfect listener is and kind of envision that when you're doing your show, or, whether it's radio or a podcast or whatever, and act like you're talking to that perfect person. And it like that just clicked in my head of something that I think I've kind of had forgotten about, and kind of something I can move, a little bit closer
All
to.
All of our listeners are perfect. Come back next week for more.
But in a way, like kind of, realizing who your ideal listener is, and it is one specific person, but it isn't one specific person at the same time.
And if you find yourself not being able to really imagine that person and focus on that, that's okay. Not everyone has that capability.
Right.
You can think of your best friend, or you can think of your mom, your dad, your cousin, your grandma, your dog.
I was going to say, I'm talking to Tina, my dog.
You know, I again, something that transfers to so many different mediums. One thing I was told by radio instructors and just what's the word? Not advisors, mentors. You know, they're like, bring a picture of your girlfriend, place it right in front of you while you're in the studio, and pretend like you're talking to her. You know, obviously within reason. Of course. If it's your girlfriend or your dog, and be, no, don't eat that.
This episode has a warning label on it.
Yeah. Yeah. Hi, baby. So yeah. So you have to be careful of those things. Obviously, with talking to that person within reason. You know. So yeah, that's something I would suggest too.
Yeah. Awesome.
This was so good. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. I mean, I'm happy to answer whatever.
We'll be picking his brain after the show. Watch for upcoming improvements.
Where can listeners find you online, find your show, or anything like that?
Sure. KankakeePodcast.com. Also on all the major podcast platforms. I mean, all the major ones you can think of: Apple, Spotify, iHeart. All the ones. YouTube, we do have video versions that are available on YouTube as well. So yeah, you can find us in all those places. We're on Facebook, Instagram. We're just at Kankakee Podcast. Follow us there. And I just want to say thank you to everyone that has listened and supported the show since the beginning. It's very humbling. And then of course both of you. For having me on.
Yeah.
This has been a lot of fun, and
awesome.
it's always such a humbling experience to be asked to be on a podcast.
Yeah.
So I really
well, we've loved having you. We've loved picking your brain on this topic, and we've learned. I'm sure I learned a lot. I'm sure you're
about to go take notes.
So for us, you can find us at UpWell The Podcast, all the places online. You can find myself personally at barefoot.katie. You can find Sarah at Sarah Behrens. So until next time, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, take care of the world around you. Bye, everybody.